I know there are writers who will say, oh my God, that's like a math equation. I can't do that. That's too complicated. But that's what our lives are, dealing with the past, being stuck in the present, and trying to understand how through doing the emotional work, we can get to the future goal.
One of the reasons I aligned to you on this is in my classes, I've had students tell me that my class is a lot cheaper than therapy. So that's one of the reasons I keep taking it over and over. So I totally agree with you. Where story comes from is from.
And I think many of my consulting clients will say the same thing. You're better than a therapist, or you're the fact that I get story and writing guidance on top of therapy. And it's all connected. It's all linked. It's all, understanding the life process, thinking about how we pull and draw from, and the emotional component of what we go through that informs what we write.
Where did you first get that kind of aha moment on that connection?
I would say, it is always evolving. Like, story is continuously evolving. When I think about when I was a studio executive in the mid 90s, when I think about how much story has evolved from then until now, where we are taking a much deeper dive into why characters do what they do. And to understand the why, we have to go into the wound. And there are many different ways to go into the wound. And for example, the most recent thing that I'm seeing that has had a major aha and evolves the way I teach story is what I came up with a story tool called the triangle of the wound. And with the triangle of the wound, what I started noticing that a lot of streaming shows were doing was they were looking at the childhood wound that we would see illustrated in the opening of a show with the flaw. So I began to connect the idea that the flaw is the story of the wound. So we wouldn't know what that childhood wound was in the opening. We would only see flawed behavior that creates anticipation. Then very often there's a trigger incident that happens before we enter the story. So you have the childhood wound, you have the trigger incident that happens before we enter the story, then your series trigger in television or streaming, or your inciting incident in film, split open both wounds. And when you develop your character from an emotional level, then you're looking at the recognition, first of all, that the character didn't heal from the earlier wound. So the fact that they didn't heal is stopping them, making them stuck in the present scenario when we enter the story as far as the dream. So in order to get to the dream, they need to utilize the present plot as a way to do the emotional work on the unhealed wound to get to the dream. So that is something that has been evolving a lot with what I teach, and that is through a continuous amount of aha moments when you're watching story, and suddenly you're figuring out, why is this working at such a high level, and how can I pass that forward in story tools so that the writer knows how to mimic and bring that to their writing.
As soon as you started talking about that, for some reason, my brain went to Squid Game.
Yes.
And the opening scene of Squid Game, playing Squid Game as children.
Yes, exactly.
And that connects right into it. Can you give us another example of one of the streamers that does something that uses this?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I can give you an example of Triangle of the Wound from Mare of Easttown. So, and I actually watched two things this weekend that it was also interesting. Like, I am always just fascinated with what we see and feel as we understand story at a deeper level. In Mayor of Easttown, what they did that was so brilliant, and I would say the story structure, have you seen Mayor of Easttown
You know, it's
with Kate
sad.
Winslet?
I actually live in Philadelphia.
Oh, okay.
So, and the series was directed by Craig Zobel, who I went to film school with.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Sad to say, I have not watched it.
Oh, you have to see it.
I
So
will.
the fascinating thing is like looking at what I just talked about. So when we enter Mare of Easttown, Mare is stuck. And the reason she's stuck is there is an earlier wound that didn't heal. And we won't know that wound as far as her childhood until like episode 7. We won't know the depth of that wound, but we will see it in her behavior. And we will learn that the trigger incident that happens before we enter the story had to do with her son. So when we enter the story, she's stuck. The series trigger and dilemma sequence goes into the chief saying, there's been a viral video on the fact that we haven't found any information on the missing woman from 1 year ago. I need you to find something. You need to recommit to this case. Meanwhile, there's a new perpetrator in the neighborhood. So you have both scenarios. You're looking at why didn't Mayor find out any answers for that previous case? And then in the personal story, you recognize that Mayor has custody or is getting custody of her grandchild. So you wonder, where is the parent of her grandchild? That creates an internal mystery that is answered by the end of the pilot. We're like, where is Mayor's child who parented Drew? And by the end of the episode, we learn that Kevin, Mayor's child, is Drew's father, but we don't know where Kevin is, and we'll find that out at the top of episode 2. So Mayor's Triangle has to do with an incident that happened with her father, and I don't want to give anything away for people who haven't seen it, but an incident that happened with her father that did not heal, that's linked to what happened to her son before we enter the story. And then Drew, so her father represents the past wound that didn't heal. What happened to her son represents the present emotional work that she needs to do in order to solve the case in the plot. She needs to start believing again. She needs to do the emotional work so that she can solve the crime. And then you have the new perpetrator, which escalates the stakes. And then Drew represents the future. So Drew represents where she went wrong and not healing the past, and then not being able to deal with her son in the way that she had hoped. Drew represents the future. So that gives you a sense of the triangle of the wound and how it creates empathy and rooting interest for a character, where we understand how the internal and personal story is going to parallel the professional story.
That is fascinating. One of the things that I love is about how deep you get into this, because one of the big issues I see with a lot of young screenwriters is they'll write an entire feature or a pilot for a show, and there's no depth, there's no point. It's just stuff happening for no reason. And you just gave a primary example how everything that happens beat by beat throughout every one of these shows and movies happens precisely because of that emotional wound.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I know there are writers who will say, oh my God, that's like a math equation. I can't do that. That's too complicated. And it's like, but that's what our lives are. Our lives are dealing with the past, being stuck in the present, and trying to understand how through doing the emotional work, we can get to the future goal. So I think if you can learn in your mind that even though it sounds technical, that technical linking brings back about emotional connection, which is everything you want for the story to work.